Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
Noble Mind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology. Hello, I'm LICSW.
And I'm Dr. Kate King. In this episode, we talk to Deirdre Fay about trauma, attachment, relationships, and healing through yoga and meditation.
Deirdre Fay has been exploring these topics personally and professionally for decades and teaches a radically positive approach to healing trauma. She's an international speaker and has written the books Becoming Safely Embodied and Attachment-Based Yoga and Meditation for Trauma Recovery. Her expertise includes sensory-motor psychotherapy, internal family systems, and mindful self-compassion.
You can get this episode's show notes and join our email list at noblemindpodcast.com and follow us on social media at noblemindpodcast. We hope you enjoy the show. We are here with Deirdre Fay. Thank you so much for joining us today on Noble Mind.
Pleasure is all mine.
So we thought we'd just start off by helping people know a little bit more about yourself and your work, how you developed a passion for what you do, and kind of what your focus is.
You know, it really comes from being in the mud of life. Yeah. I lived at a yoga ashram back in the 80s and 90s. I'd been meditating since the 70s, but got drawn to live in an ashram. And it was in that safe environment that my own trauma history came up, and which I didn't know I had. And I was stupefied by how there was such a before and after, how I could meditate, do yoga, be in my body, train for triathlons before. And then afterwards, all I wanted to do is hide and just live in my comforter and never leave the house. And I was really trying to figure out what happened, especially from the frame of, we think about yoga being that says the body is the temple for the soul. Well, I was not living in a temple. And I wanted to get back there. And so that really was the driving force, is the motivation for my own transformation. And so I started just really doing a lot of reading, and searching was in my own therapy. At that time, there was so little written about meditation and trauma. And so I started doing some writings about that and had, integrating that from my own treatment and, all the retreats I was doing at the same time. So that's really where it came from. Then I went to school, got my social work degree. I did a year of training at McLean Hospital. And while I was there, some people heard that I had been practicing yoga and lived in an ashram. And so they invited me to teach on the dissociative unit and be with the people that were there in the evening. I wasn't paid for it. It was just part of my love. Could this really work? What helped me? Could this help other people? And then Bessel Vanderkolk heard about the work I was doing and had me join him in their clinic. I started leading groups there, which became first the Becoming Safely Embodied skills, which really were the skills that helped me put my life back together. And so then from there, I just kept journeying. And then I started studying with Dan Brown on attachment, and that was like the missing piece. And I realized that's why trauma doesn't heal, is because of the underlying attachment issues. So that became, a really big force for a long time. I studied with him for about 13 years. We were meeting pretty much weekly at that point with a small group of us, and that culminated in the book that we wrote together, Attachment Disturbances in Adults. What was coming up for me while I was learning that is I loved the theory. I loved it, and it made so much sense, but I wanted to be changed in here.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want just a conceptual frame. I wanted to be different.
Mm-hmm.
So my quest at that point was, how do I really change myself? And that's the possibility, and which is such a thrill. And now that's what I teach around the world, and all the online courses and workshops I do. It's just amazing. I just heard from somebody just a half hour ago who talked about the change that they have gone through. And it's like, that is amazing to be able to be a gift, a channel for that. So that's the reason why I do what I do. I guess that's the reason why we all do what we do.
Thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate your sharing your own personal journey. I think it's easy to get talking in the third person, when we talk about this kind of stuff. And I just really appreciate in your writing and your teaching that you really start from your own experience and build out from there, with all the other expertise and education and training you've had. It really, it's a very wonderful integration.
Thank you.
And also, you're being open about trauma recovery from the inside destigmatizes. So thank you for that.
Yes. And that's one of the things I think people have such a need for. And what they find, certainly in our online groups, is there's no hierarchy of I've done it and you haven't, or I'm the fixed one and you're not. Like, it comes from a place of how do we create safety for each other, and how do we just see the best in ourselves and other people, and that creates an enormous safety and capacity for healing, I think. So thank you for noticing that.
Mm-hmm.
And your approach combines attachment-based psychotherapy, yoga, part psychology, as well as mindfulness and self-compassion. Do I have them all?
It's a nice soup you've built.
Well, and this is what I noticed about attachment theory, which was so mind-boggling, is that what's embedded in yoga and meditation is also what's embedded in attachment theory, is that there is an underlying push, yearning for healing and for connection and wholeness. And certainly we're finding that more and more with the field of trauma as it changes toward post-traumatic growth, instead of being submerged in always excavating the past and finding what's wrong. And the intersection of them is beautiful, and it's alive, because I think it's part of all the great wisdom traditions, not just one particular one. So to me, that's the thrill, is finding that thread that links everything together.
I wonder if it makes sense to speak a little bit about attachment before going on to discussing self-compassion, body access, and so on.
Sure.
Perhaps to the uninitiated who hears the word attachment and thinks who knows what, but probably not
Right.
the jargony word that we know in our mental health training. Just how do you think about it? How would you define attachment?
Well, attachment theory came from the great work of John Bowlby, who we can think of as a grandfather of attachment theory, a grandfather of connection. Robert Caron, who wrote a great book about attachment, said that what attachment really is about love. And yet, in our clinical world, we try to find something that's too amorphous. So we try to find other stuff around it. And what Bowlby did in his research is look for the signposts of what they are. And I've thought about that a lot. And in my work with Dan Brown is thinking about what are the main qualities. Like, how do you know inside your own body that you are safely attached? And we know that there's a huge important piece about being safe psychologically, emotionally, and physically. And if you don't have that, then it's hard to really progress in any other way, that we are going to stay tight and constricted and frozen in some way. So then, but being able to be comforted and soothed, to be reassured, to have people see the best in us. Dan Brown really gave me this term of express delight, which I didn't know because it wasn't part of my own upbringing, is to have people be express delight. But what is it like to have somebody just be so delighted in who you are for no reason whatsoever, just because you exist? It's like, what a longing and need that is for all of us. And if we don't have it, how we wither inside. So these kind of really important attachment needs are critical. Being able to be soothed, be able to be mentored and guided, and have somebody help not just show us the steps, but break down a task into smaller and smaller bits so that it's easier to take those steps. To be able to know how to move through conflict, that is so critical. Many of us didn't have that. And to be able to learn how to take life not personally, non-defensively. When we're safe in relationship, safe in connection, then it's this magic experience. We don't get as personally invested in having to prove that we're right or wrong. It's just like, oh yeah, right, okay. And I've seen this in people who are naturally securely attached. And the research shows that 1 out of 4 of us are actually securely attached. The rest of us have to work at it. But the good news is that we can get there, that we actually can remap those strategies. And so instead of, in the research we talk about, there's secure attachment, which is somebody who has those kind of qualities that I talked about, or develop them, earn them over their life. And then we have people who are anxiously attached. Their caregiver was not attentive enough, or intermittently or inconsistently attentive. And so the anxiety that develops, the preoccupation with the external world is so huge. On another extreme, it could be if we've been so ignored or isolated that we really shut people out and we keep them out. And so we have the whole range. And then there was another whole researcher who found other little qualities. But for most part, with clients, we just keep it simple. You're anxiously attached or you're dismissive. You find that relationships aren't that important, or your learned behavior is they're not important. So that's the whole range of attachment.
So these discoveries and the theoretical base that's being constructed seems to conflict pretty fundamentally with what the French call hyper-individualism of modern society.
Say more about that, of hyper-individual.
Sort of like the rugged individual who pulls up his own socks.
We need nobody and nothing.
We can think about the Marlboro man and the
Yes.
No attachment needed, maybe to his horse.
Well, we think right. That might fall in what we call the dismissive style. Somebody that says relationships aren't important. I don't need anybody. I can do it all by myself. But the reality is, it's just not true. Mm-hmm. You know, we know that for a fact that we need people, and we know that when there's enough safety, the system relaxes and interacts with each other, you know, a much more satisfying and sustaining way. Mm-hmm. The fantasy is we can do it all on our own. And many of us have tried that. Right. And it doesn't work as well.
That's the established view, it seems, that's promoted by the culture.
It sure is. That's right.
Yeah, it can feel sort of like a vulnerability to need other people. You know, either if you're anxiously attached, you need other people, and that's scary, and you're sort of scrambling to try to make the connections work. Or maybe if you're dismissive, it's, you know, vulnerable to need other people, so you kind of just back away. But either way, it's kind of a vulnerable feeling to let yourself actually admit to yourself that you really need other people.
And one of the key things that I like to work with people on is that idea that everything can rise, crest, and fall. Mm-hmm. You know, so that anxious need for love me, love me, love me, please be my friend, or whatever it might be, is that if we can be with our own body, our own system, that energy is going to rise, crest, and fall. In yoga, we actually have the term pratyahara, which is, how do I take my senses that are turned outward and turn them inward and be with what's going on? And this is a key developmental task for those who are anxiously attached, so that they can actually let that energy move in and through them instead of being so invested in whatever should happen outside themselves.
You call it the bell curve of experience?
Right. Right. I recently, you know, with all the stuff going on about the pandemic, I started to talk about how we have to flatten our own curve and learn how to surf that inner turbulence.
That's so true. Yeah. Well, this maybe segues nicely into talking a little bit about self-compassion, you know, since being able to flatten that inner curve or ride that wave feels like that's a wonderful skill that we can develop. And anyone who's listened to the podcast before, we've had a couple of folks on who've introduced self-compassion. But nonetheless, I'd love to hear how you sort of describe it to people in the context of the work that you do and how you apply it.
Sure. Well, because I'm so steeped in the meditation world, what I teach a lot, and of course I talk about living untriggered, that there are 4 pieces of meditation that we want to cultivate. Mindfulness, being able to name and notice what's going on outside. Concentration, being able to focus on where we want to go, especially if we're triggered. You know, if our whole system is pulling us in many different directions, but we need to be able to concentrate and focus and go where we need to go instead of drawn into the vortex. And then we need self-compassion, because this life is so darn difficult, you know, that we need to be able to be kind to ourselves and have that felt experience that Chris Germer talks so much about. And that's so essential, especially for people who have or experience themselves as broken. And then the other important quality, which I got through my training and development with Jean Klein, who's a great, or was until he passed, an enormously powerful influence on my life, on non-dual teachings, practices of Advaita yoga, of knowing that there's no separation. And, you know, if we think about it in terms of attachment, we are a child, an infant is completely connected. We call it symbiosis, right? There's no separation. That over time, what a child needs to do is learn how to be separate, right? But then our adult developmental task is actually, how do I come home to myself and be connected inside myself while staying connected to everybody? So these beautiful interweavings of the meditation world and attachment and yoga is all there. It's quite lovely. Now, what happens, and what I think about self-compassion, and certainly in the frame that I use around shame, is that the reason we experience shame is that these natural and normal needs that we have to be connected get disrupted. And if we think about it, if we use Bowlby's term of having a secure self, a secure base inside, the natural native inclination of the body, of the mind, is to stretch outside of that and to reach and explore and be curious about the world, right? But inevitably what happens is, as we reach out into the world, something is going to happen, right? It's never, anytime we reach outside of our comfort zone, there's going to be some kind of anxiety or turbulence. And we need to know that there's somebody safe that we can return to so that our system recalibrates. Now, if we don't have that, and for many people that's not the case, when they reach out or they have to do something or they take some risks, something, that anxiety comes, they don't get the needs met the way they want, and then they end up feeling terrible. They feel like there's something wrong with me. There's a character flaw, but it's not a character flaw. The needs that you have are normal. Of course you want to be reassured. Of course you want to be loved. Of course you want to get some help and guidance on how to do so. That's so normal. But if you don't get it, the shame is overwhelming. So we need to have self-compassion to just be able to hold that amount of physiological, what are we going to call that? The tsunami of horror that happens, to calm our systems, to give ourselves a little bit of a break so that we can be with ourselves. We absolutely need that. So that's the whole frame that I have for shame as an attachment wound and the importance and necessity of building self-compassion.
So self-compassion is the medicine for shame.
A nice way to say that. Yeah, Alex. Yeah. Yeah.
Which is itself caused by developmental trauma.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious why, when this happens, self-criticism, self-hatred, you call it self-persecution, why does that arise in this context?
Well, what I've seen is that people who have a secure self, who had enough good guidance and mentoring growing up, they don't persecute themselves. They don't beat themselves up. They're able to shrug it off in a simpler way. But the reason why we don't is that need underneath is so strong, so that we beat ourselves up because it's a way of denying or shaming that need that we have. So simple, you know what that means. It means it's not simple, but a simple way to do it is to explore when that shame comes up. It's like, honey, what do you need? What do you need right now? Do you need comfort? Do you need soothing? Do you need reassurance? Do you need to know how proud of you I am, about the effort that you put in and how good a being you are, and how I can see how wonderful you are and how hard you're trying? Just simple things. What is that need that's in there? And when people start connecting that, the shame starts dissolving. It takes time, but it starts reducing enough that people can live inside their skin. And then they can have a cognitive capacity to interrupt those automatic negative thinking that goes on.
So you write about therapeutic tasks in relation to each chapter. What is the therapeutic task in relation to self-compassion, or shame, rather?
Wow, that's a big one, isn't it? Because shame is such a physiological distress. And whether you're in a clinical setting or if you're doing it with yourself, so much of it is being able to breathe and take a thimbleful of the shame, not to be immersing yourself into it, but how do you step back and start calming your body, start learning how to slow down, So you can ride, instead of having a big rise, crest, and fall, you can take a tiny little segment that just breathe through. And we do this in meditation. When we're sitting, we're trying to not go with the whole thing, but try to slice it really thin so that we can actually integrate that one tiny moment rather than getting caught in the whole. So that's the simplest version. But there's many layers. So we have to look at what are the thoughts that you have going on, what are the feelings going on, what are the body sensations, and how can you begin to interrupt the patterns that are so habitual at that point.
And you emphasize how there's hope.
Oh, yes. Listen, if I can do it, you can do it. I was so lost in it all. And absolutely and I see it over and over and over, people making changes in the most phenomenal ways, from some of the very most dissociated people to being able to stay present and be with their life and have the life that they want to cultivate. It's really remarkable. And that's what I love about the work that we're doing, all of us, that there is a way forward. If we think about it in terms of meditation, the Buddha said, there is a way. There is a way, and here's the way through. It is hard. But there is a way through it. And we can't give up hope because the path is there. In fact, the path is exactly the moment that we're in right now.
A map has been figured out of this forest.
Yes.
You emphasize how it's important for the therapist to share with the client that there is a map.
Yes.
There's a plan.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Don't you think that's so important? Because otherwise
Yes,
we're like,
absolutely.
We're freaked out. We're like, there is a map.
The next part of your book talks about safe and secure access to the body. So I'm wondering if we could kind of get into that world a little bit more and talk about what does that phrase mean for you in your work, the secure body access?
Well, if you think about it, right, the reason we don't want to be in our body is because there's so much chaos in there. Like, who wants to be inside if it's a mess? But that's where our wisdom is. That's, if we can access our own wisdom, that movement inside that's guiding us toward a richer life. Mm-hmm. Despite how crummy life is, how hard it is, there's something inside. It's a goodness. It's a movement toward compassion, toward aliveness. If we can tap into that, that's what we can follow. And what I think happens so much, and what is such a problem maybe, is that when clients come to see us, they want us to tell them what to do. And it's a fine dance between how do we give them the map, but also return them to themselves. This is something that they didn't have. They didn't have anybody who said, you are so fascinating. Let's figure out who you are. Mm-hmm. And if we put those pieces together inside you, where do you want to move toward? What do you want to have open up? Like, that is the gift. Like, that's where I could just sob with, like, that's the important part, is people returning home to themselves and then being able to listen and use that moment-to-moment guidance as a way to follow their path forward. So the question then is, how do you do it, right? And how do you slow down time enough so that you can break it apart? And of course, we can't ignore that there's thinking going on, and we can't ignore all the feelings that happen. But we also have to train ourselves in attuning to the sensations that are there and being able to access that. And in fact, one of the ways I usually do this as a drawing because it makes more sense that way, but Dan Stern, the great psychoanalyst, talked about vibrational affect. These minute little moments, like if we look at the light or if we look at dust in the air, we don't have cognitive thoughts about it necessarily. We can say, oh, the dust is floating in the air. But that felt experience is a felt experience in our body. Eugene Gendlin talked about the felt experience. Many of the body therapists talk about pulsatory energy. We have to be able to be with that. We do this when we're in meditation. We're sitting, the mind starts slowing down, and we can access something. That's really the fulcrum out of which wisdom grows, I think. That's where it is. but how do we get there? And that's helping people separate out all the many components so they can actually sit inside themselves and be with what arises.
Yeah, I think that experience of being disconnected from your body is a way of also, or ends up also disconnecting us from our intuition or like literally our gut feeling on something, right? So people kind of bounce around in their head all day long about what to do, or like sort of stuck in the sort of thinking spiral on whatever the topic of the day might be, and it's hard to get out of it. And I think sometimes that's, the way out is to get more into the body, like you're saying.
That's beautifully said, Kate. Yeah. The way out is the way in.
Right. Yeah.
And you talk about how these building blocks of the present moment, thoughts, feelings, and body sensations, you're alluding to how the person learns to identify these, as well as you write about how to separate feelings from facts from interpretations.
Mm-hmm.
So then they can say, okay, so these are the little pieces flying around.
Right.
And what is the pattern here? Mm. And you also talk about how to learn to be with bare experiences.
It's amazing how much we live by shorthands, instead of, and we know this as meditators, right? Instead of being with what's there, we have quick constructions about it, conceptual frames that we jump to because it's just easier. If somebody says, "How are you doing?" we say, "Oh, fine." But I've been around a lot of meditators who've been deep in meditation. And they say, "How are you?" And they're like, they check, right? They really want to be true to their own experience. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, we don't have the time to do that. We're moving at a totally different pace. So we use those shorthands. But in order to, if we want to, like Peter Fonagy, the great attachment theorist, says we can remap our inner world. But how we remap our attachment is by having to be in contact with it and not just be thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think of body access or supporting safe and secure body access as coming before dealing with dissociation or with triggering experiences?
I don't know if I'd say before, but my experience of people who can be really severely dissociated is they're just checked out in a certain way. And this is another way we can return to Bowlby's work. He did some research with James Robertson about separation distress, and what they mapped out were these three phases of separation. First is protest, where a child is actively protesting. And then the second is despair, when they think, oh my God, the loved object, the caregiver is not coming back, and they fall into despair. And then the third phase is that of detachment. And if we look at that we can see that that's so much of what happens with dissociation. People detach from themselves, from the situation, as a way of managing the huge amount of unmet need that's coming up. So the task is to invite people to be able to build enough of a self-structure inside to contain that and be with themselves, rather than either dissociating completely from it or grasping so firmly for it from the outside. But that's, that is a huge, huge process. And so building safety is there in the relationship, that you can have it. I'm here, I'm listening, I'm tracking you, I'm curious about what's going on inside. But at some point also inviting the person to take residence in their own being.
I have this sense that dissociation is really poorly understood, that there can be a kind of, among people who have some kind of psychology background, there's sort of a brushstroke sense of like the worst case scenario, of like somebody in the middle of a flashback or losing time or something, but I think that, there's a whole continuum of dissociative experiences. And I'm wondering if you could help ground our conversation a little bit and what some kind of dissociative experiences might be that would fall on that dissociation continuum, but people may not realize it, or something to make it feel a little bit more accessible.
Well, there is, as you said, the whole spectrum. Like on probably the easier end of the spectrum is when we used to drive.
Back in the day, right? Before, yeah.
We go to our office and the way so easily and well that you forget what you're doing. And you just, actually, it happened the other day. I was going somewhere And I started heading toward my office. And I was like, why am I going there? But it was just habit. I just turned that way. That's a dissociative experience. I wasn't connecting the thought of where I was going in the moment.
I have the experience of forgetting if I shampooed in the shower.
Right.
I'm going to either have very clean hair or very dirty hair. Yeah.
Exactly.
But right. So that sometimes when you're just operating on habit, like autopilot, it can feel that's a little a mini version.
Disconnected from the moment of what. And then on the very far end are incredible moments where different parts of ourselves take over and do something that is unknown to other parts of us. And we wonder why that happened or how that happened. There's like you said, this incredible spectrum. There has been so much shaming about that. Like there's something wrong rather than, certainly in the last 10 years in the trauma field, dissociation, people are much more accepting. Like, this is what happens. This is what happens.
Might another example be if you're in an argument of some kind and feeling kind of overstimulated and sort of checking out a little bit so that afterwards you may not even remember the conversation or.
Oh, beautiful. That's a great example. Okay.
Yeah.
Those are more on the normal.
Right.
And then there's also the really more complicated ones.
Mm-hmm.
As in the time capsule experience that you talk about?
Well, what I was trying to do with that idea of the time capsules is that I wanted to help people get how much they're living in that there's two worlds happening at one point. There's this moment, and then there's the past moment. And this is not, anatomically correct, it's not biologically correct. But what we do is we have these memories, like the first time we went to school, the first time we rode a bike, first time anything. We tuck them away in what I call a time capsule. It's just something that we're put inside ourselves. And then we can access it. I can talk about it and it's there, and my hippocampus is involved and it's clear, or I can speak about it like a little cocktail party. But what happens for people is and actually this happened just this morning. I got an email from somebody. I sent out a PDF to people if they wanted it. What do you do when you're triggered? And this person read it and she said, I hope you don't mind my asking, but could you change one word in it's a 10-page PDF or something. And the word was sip, because she lives with people right now who are actively trying to be sober, on the edge of not being sober. And I forget how she put it, but she wanted me to change that because that was triggering her. And what I said is, we get triggered. You are going to get triggered. But what if you link together sip, like sipping like a wonderful glass of water, and how refreshing that is, and how satisfying and nurturing that is. Like how good that would. You're linking together one thing with something else so that you have that and you can consolidate that, versus for some reason she gets triggered because sip is connected to all that. So that something happened in her where sip was connected to this time capsule of all these memories and associations. And so wanting to calm that, what we usually do is when we have a time capsule of something stuffed up, we try to change the outside world so that we can have a better feeling inside world. But that never works. It might work once or twice, but it's not going to work consistently.
It's a difficult way to relate to the world.
Right. So that time capsule erupts into our present experience, and we live like it's happening now. And Mary Main is one of the great attachment theorists, talked about how the past is always invading the present, right? And so the past could be just 2 minutes ago with somebody else, but it could be years and years and years stuffed full. And so that's the idea behind the time capsules.
In terms of the term flashback, when we watch a film, a flashback is literally, a sequence from when the person was in Vietnam. But when we talk about flashback in psychology, are we talking about a melding of feelings and thoughts from the past situation with present time reality?
That's a fascinating conversation, Alex, because we could think about it as being on another spectrum. So on one level, the more extreme are the flashbacks of somebody running through the woods thinking they're caught in some wartime experience. On another experience is what Mary Main was pointing out about how the past is invading the present. Phil Bromberg talked about the reenactments that we do, the enactments that are happening. And these are happening all the time. Like, why does somebody marry the same person over and over again and have the same, what Gottman would call the perennial problem, right? It's because that everything is entrained in us to see life a certain way. And Bowlby has a whole explanation around this that he calls the internal working model. But it's that in that whole spectrum. So we could be you could be saying something and I could be having a flashback, but it's more like I'm looking through that lens of life, right? So this is where it's so fascinating to me about the intersection of yoga, trauma, meditation, attachment, because Bowlby talked about this internal working model, which is like a contact lens out of which we see the world. So if I lived in a felt experience as a child of violence and rage and sexual leaking energy around me, that is imprinted in me. And my interactions with the world are going to be through that lens, and that lens is unknown to me. And my task is to clear that lens, and this is what yoga talks about, meditation, Mahamudra, Sauchana is all about clearing that lens so that we are free to be with whatever arises.
I love the example of a contact lens because, right, you can't even look around the rim like you could with glasses or something. It really is like such 100% overlay that it's hard to know it's even there until you see it, until there's that moment of awareness that comes through that, oh, wait, maybe this isn't what's happening right now. Maybe this is what I think is happening because, this is what's always happened in my childhood or what have you.
We say it's real.
Yeah.
Real.
Yeah.
And it's like we can only see this. And Paul Gilbert talks a lot about it. We're born into these cultures in our societies where this is the way we are. And he often uses the example of he wouldn't be the Paul Gilbert we knew if he grew up in a gang world, where there was violence everywhere. He would be a different person. And that would be true for all of us. So we are so subject to that. And yet if we clear as much of that as we can out of the way, something else blossoms.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if it would be helpful for listeners to hear from you a couple ideas about how to work with a trigger, if they're sort of aware that there might be something in their life experience that functions that way. What might they start to do to try to address that?
Sure, I'd love to. This is one of my one of the things I love to do. So, well, first of all, I'd say that we need to reframe triggering. It's not like we want to get rid of triggering because we're always going to be triggered. The question is, who do I want to be in relationship to getting triggered? Am I going to be able to use it for my own growth and development? This is, if I think back to what Bowlby talked about protest, I often talk to people about, this is a protest. This is protest behavior. You're upset about something. Okay, great. So what is over here that if you're protesting, your body is saying something else. If I could, bring in yoga again at this point, is we think about prana is that life force energy that's flowing in and through and around us all the time. We can't stop it. It's a part of what connects us to everything, everywhere, all the time. So what happens, though, is prana, as it's moving through our system in and around us, hits up against things that are clusters or knots, or in yoga we call them samskaras, the wound, the knot. And prana is still like, okay, honey, I want to take you home to yourself. This is where you want to go. And so prana is like coming through and pouring through us like a torrent of energy. And it hits this knot, and it's like it hits a boulder, and it's like crushing into it. And we experience that as like, dysregulating. If we take the stance that prana is just saying, let's just clean this out of the road so that you can relax and be free. It's a different state, but the felt experience of it is really hard to deal with. But if we can ease our way into it, that energy moves through, cleans it out, and then we're like, we have a little bit more room. So that's one of the main reasons that I think of having a trigger is to get free. But we need to be able to see, okay, here this trigger happened. Where is life trying to direct me? Instead of just forcing me to live as some crummy creature on the planet, just like huddling in the corner. No, life is saying, let's clear that out of you. That's not who you are. That's not who you are. So you have these negative thoughts about yourself. You have these horrible experiences in your body, these terrible life circumstances that happen and memories. Let's clear that. Let's get that out of the way. And what is the need that you have right now? And what is it trying to invite you into the next step? And so using it in that way becomes more of a transformational model than as a painful life circumstance where you're always stuck model.
So as miserable as the triggered response is experienced as, it actually contains clues.
Exactly. Beautiful, Alex. Yes.
With which you can construct your own roadmap out of the forest.
Yes. And Lisa Feldman-Barrett, she speaks about the construction of emotions. And it's exactly that. It's how do we literally put the pieces together in a way that's more satisfying for ourselves.
But those skills need to be learned with the therapist as a container or a supportive being.
Yes.
Mindfulness, and it has to be done thimbleful by thimbleful.
Yes. Perfect. Exactly.
It reminds me of the quote, "The obstacle is the path."
Yes, exactly. That's right.
Right. Where it's like, that's the only way you're going to sort of get to the other side or get to a healthier place is when that trigger comes up to really, try to create some space around it and be curious about it. So I love that you teach more about how to actually do that work.
I practiced a lot with the Sufis for years. And one of my great Sufi teachers would talk about how we want to actually let the love, the energy just move in and through us like water around boulders in the stream. So in therapy, what tends to happen is we get caught by the boulder. We're like, oh, here's a fear, a block, a resistance. Let's dig into it. But what the Sufis were teaching me is no, just roll around that. Identify with the love, identify with the water rather than the boulder. And in fact, one of the first times I did a meditation retreat with Dan Brown, I'd been really immersed in parts work at that point. And I said, oh my God, Dan, I have a part coming up. He said, we're not dealing with parts. We're dealing with the whole. And it's the same thing there again. But I think as therapists, we don't know how to hold both that frame, but also help people move toward this other reality. And it makes me think about what John Gottman talks about it with couples, is that you need to have, for every one crummy thing that happens, you need to have 5 good things. So that what he talks about is having enough in the emotional bank account. And like, to me, that's true. In order for me to withstand one thing, I need to have a reservoir of goodness. And Rick Hansen talks a lot about this as well. And so the same thing we need to be cultivating ourselves. Yes, you're going to get triggered. But let's also spend time just seeing how fabulous you are and what a magnificent being you are and the light that you carry and how delighted I am by being with you. And then, you have this trigger.
What are the therapeutic tasks in relation to triggered responses? What are helpful or unhelpful ways of approaching them?
Slowing down, training a person to not just be activated all the time, but to slow down. And that those people who practice meditation, this is so helpful, right? Being able to slow things down. It's essential. And when you do that, it's like, you can. Then you have to unpack it. What is happening in that? Is it a thought that's triggering it? Is it a feeling that's triggering it? Is it a body sensation? Is it a memory? You might not know, because sometimes these things flood through as a conglomeration, and we have to slowly start peeling it apart. But we need to be able to slow down enough to peel that apart. In the Becoming Safely Embodied skills, we talk about really deconstructing a trigger. Do you want to start at the beginning of the trigger, or do you, after the trigger happened, and work your way back? So there's many different ways to do it, but there's always something that occurred that created this thing and allowed this time capsule to erupt. So what was it? And then once you do, to be able to link it together, you're here in this moment, and where are all the links to that previous moment in there? There's something in there in the past that happened that had that be activating, or else it wouldn't be activating. We think about this in terms of what Carl Lorenz talked about imprinting, with the little goslings. And so if we're imprinted, we want to look at where the root of the imprint is. And sometimes we have to slowly walk our way into that to figure it out. But otherwise, we wouldn't be triggered.
How does triggering relate to re-traumatization and re-experiencing? Like, I'm confused about those terms.
Well, that's a great question. Well, what tends to happen is, you remember when we had LPs in the records, and you'd get a scratch on it, and you'd go right and you ball and over it. It's the same thing. Re-triggering is something happened in your past, but then it's like we live in it, and we immerse ourselves in it over and over and over, and we just get lost in it. And we don't know how to get out of it because that feels so real. And the reason it feels real is because it was embedded so early on. Otherwise, we'd have some other perspective. But it's so immersed. So then we just swirl in it over and over and over again. And so how do we step out of it is really important. And it takes some skillfulness, or it takes practice. And some of it are just simple skills, like being able to separate a fact out from what's going on. And we think, well, the fact is I'm just a terrible person, and this always happens to me all the time. Well, no, that's not a fact. It's not a fact. We know this from meditation. The fact is, right now, I'm talking and you're listening. The fact is, we're on Zoom. It's not, then the storyline starts to dissipate. But otherwise we can swirl too much. The story, the affect of it is too captivating. Sometimes I think about one of the main skills of changing a trigger is learning how to have the present moment be affectively magnetic. So what does that mean? So somebody's caught in the horribleness of experience. There's like a dopamine hit to that. As hard as it is, as horrible as it's captivating. Okay, so how do you become captivated by something else? And this is where addictions come in, or overeating, undereating, overexercise, all that comes in here because people are seeking that hit and so in some ways then the addiction is better than being caught in the painful internal experience, but then that becomes its own thing. So how do we then sit with what would be so wonderful about this color green? Really getting immersed and loved in the color green and the felt experience, the taste of it, but we don't do that. And this is, Rick Hansen talks a lot about this, about really deepening into those simple moments.
I really liked what you said about, very decisively, like slowing down as so essential in trying to do any of this, and then figuring out how to slow down also, in terms of figuring out what are the things that help you really kind of downregulate and create that sort of bandwidth so you can look into what your experiences are.
And training ourselves to see, where on that bell curve do I get off? Do I get off when I start feeling something? Do I get off when I'm like, oh no, I can't come down from this feeling? Where is it that our system says, I got to shut this down, rather than training ourselves to let life just move through us?
Could you tell us a little bit about your approach to working with boundaries, how you see those?
I could just talk about the physical boundaries, but what I became much more interested along the way with the intersubjective boundaries, the internal boundaries between people. And I think this is often where most of the problems come in. And as I really deepened into it, I realized the whole idea of self-other differentiation. Where do I begin? And where do you begin over there? And where's the space in between? And so as we've already talked about it, with people who are anxiously attached, they're going to have a very merged self-other. So that boundary gets dissipated, right? They're instead of staying inside their own skin, they're over there in you. I'm trying to figure out, Kate, what are you thinking? What do you feel? Alex, what about you? That was just so great. I just love what you said. And Kate, and this, and I'm all out there and I'm not in here, right?
Trying to guess what other people are thinking and feeling.
Right.
And yeah.
Right. And on the reverse, those people who are more dismissive are going to be pushing away. I'm not going to think about what you want, but it's a pretend thing because, of course, whenever we're not securely attached, that we're always trying to figure out the world. But part of it is I'm trying to keep you out of my world so that I can have a sense of my own self inside. So it works in those two different ways. And the boundary is, how do I live inside my own skin? And inside my skin, how do I find those places of reserve or replenishment and literally train myself to access that at the same time I'm connecting to somebody else? It's interesting. I've been talking to therapists who are in my consultation groups around being on Zoom all the time now, and how hard they are. Some people find it hard to actually get information from from the Zoom call. But I think the more skilled we are in the intersubjective world, we are in a felt experience. I get information from my eyes, of course. But if I close my eyes and I'm with you, I enter your world in a different way. And it's by using my own felt experience to be connected in a way that's so alive. Now, I'm sure you've had this experience, is somebody's talking to you and suddenly you get a hit of something about them. But then you're not sure, is it me? Is it you? It happens with dissociation. If we're working with somebody who's strongly dissociated, we suddenly feel like, oh my God, I'm just going to go to fall asleep. Is it me? Is it that I X, Y, and Z? Or am I picking up the felt experience of my client, right? And their experience. So often I would say in those cases, wow, I'm just really like feeling a little out of it. Is it me or is it you? Is this your experience? And it'll be so interesting what happens. Many times they'll be like, yes. And it makes me think about do you ever see that movie, The March of Penguins?
I haven't, no.
Oh my God, it's such a sweet movie. And I hope I don't gross you out by saying this, but the adult empire penguins, the males, are actually the ones that feed their babies. And how they feed their babies is they eat something, they digest it, and then they regurgitate it. And I was like, oh my God. But this is what we're doing with our clients, is we're in that field with them, open to them, and we're picking up their experience. We're taking it in, and then it's about handing it back. Now, the problem is, for many clients that I work with, is that and this was my experience, this is what I had to work through, is I would take it in and it would get stuck there. So I became a storehouse for other people's experiences. I had to learn how to actively take it out and hand it back. And in fact, I began to realize, if I'm holding on to it, I'm not allowing them the opportunity to grow, develop, and flourish. Ed Tronick talks about character comes through stress. We build that, and we need a certain amount of stress. But if I'm not handing that back to them, then somebody's not going to be able to take the steps to grow themselves with me at the same time. So that's the sort of a short and involved response to what I think about boundaries.
You also write about the embodied need cycle.
Yes. This comes from the work of Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen and some of the body-based infant students to teachers. It's amazing work that they're doing. But what we see is a child, an infant, one of the first movements they have is they're laying there and they don't have any muscle response. They're just completely absorbed in life. Their bodies are so relaxed. But then whatever starts to happen is they see something really interesting out there in the world, and their arms start moving and they start reaching for it, right? And that simple act of reaching is so important. We can talk more about that. But so reaching is there. And then what do? They maybe they see their toes off in the distance and they grab their toes, right? So grabbing is another thing, that muscle building of grabbing. And then they pull the toes, right? Yum, yum, yum. And they smell it and they eat them and they suckle on them. And it's this wonderful experience, right? And then they let go again. So that cycle of reaching, grabbing, pulling, drawing it to you. And then what I've added in is this ability to actually take it all the way in, to savor it, to let it just melt into your being, right? That is that embodied cycle of attachment. We have it all the time. So if somebody feels like, oh, nobody loves me, well, what's it like to reach out and make contact? Or, and which is so often the case, is people say, well, nothing good ever happens to me. Well, what do you actually let it come in? Do you let that experience come in, or do you swat it away? Like if you let it come in and let it fill you and you enjoy it, it's like, oh, how precious it can be, right? But what happens is all these fears and blocks come up. So we have to deconstruct those along the way. Does that answer your question, Alex?
It does, absolutely. You also write, when people don't get what they need, when they consistently don't get what they need as they're growing up, then they end up with this wounding, and this natural cycle of a need or want arising, cresting, falling is disrupted. Yes. So it no longer works. So then not only are they not aware of their needs, what do I want? I want X, and I'm going to get it, and then I'm going to be satisfied for getting it. So this whole thing is broken, and instead what you get is self-blame and shame that they are the problem.
Right.
That essential functional cycle is broken.
Beautiful. You said it so lovely. Right. I was thinking of a client who is really wanting to change how she is in relationship and have, instead of being defended, to actually allow relationships in. So in the book, I talk a lot about one of the practices of reaching out, opening, and then drawing to. And it's about training the body to actually have a different experience, to reach for the experience you want, then to open to it, to allow it to, instead of being tight around it, to train your body to open to it and expand. And then what's it like to gather that up and really just keep bringing it in, bringing it in, bringing it in. And the body, you'll actually feel, when I've led this with groups, you can feel like hesitation as it enters in, the body system. But what this person is doing is literally trying to, her experience of being in nature is so satisfying. And so when she's in nature, she's reaching out to the wonderful experience, opening to it, drawing it in, and training her body to have the experience of this is how wonderful it could be. And then what she's doing is linking it to different things about relationship and different kinds of relationships she wants, so that the neural synapses are going to start moving in a different direction. Instead of I've got to be tight and restricted around, it's like, oh, this is what relationship could be like. And so that, and frankly, this is what I did in my own experience. I moved from a relationship that was probably not the best one for me. I was in it for 16 years, so it was a long-term practice session. and to really, I thought, I want something different, but I didn't know how to have something different because it's so embedded in us. So I trained myself, I trained my body, my mind and heart to have a different experience. And literally what came out of it is a man that I'm married to that is amazingly securely attached with an enormous heart and light and just a goodness that is like blows me away to this day. But I had to train myself to even be open to having that kind of experience instead of having what was so familiar and normal to me.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful and inspiring. Thank you. Recently, I've been immersing myself in mindful self-compassion. So I took the 8-week course and now I'm doing the community for deepening practice and just doing all the practice sessions.
Oh, great.
It's such fantastic stuff. And as you well know, resistance is a big topic in mindful self-compassion. And your book has quite a few ideas about how people can relate when resistance arises. So I was curious, do you think of resistance as protest?
Yes.
Okay. There's
Yes.
attachment protest. It shouldn't be like this.
At some level, our system, it's not a conscious thing, our habit is like tight. Why am I tightening right here? What it would rather have is open, relaxed. Oh, but why am I tightening? There's some way our system learned to tighten. Like I have 2 grandkids at the moment. So when you touch their bodies, they're so yummy. They're like mush balls. There's no resistance in them, right? There's almost no muscle in there. It's such a lovely experience. But what happens is over time, right? Somebody says something mean and we tighten up around our heart, and then it becomes chronic, and then we start getting stressed and we pull our muscles up around our ears and we start living out of that. Mm. But who we are at our true nature is this pure, open, vast, luminous field. We are one. We are that which is already there. So yes, but undoing resistance isn't. And then that's where I love the Sufis training of not having to deal with the resistance. You deal with what is it that's wanting to flow in and around. Like what is self-compassion? Yes, you're resistant, but focus on the self-compassion and let it soften and enter your system.
Your latest book is a wonderful addition to mindful self-compassion because it explains why the practices are the way they are. And it offers a lot of tools in terms of what can be done when resistance arises. But there's always other stuff you could do to move the process forward.
Thank you, Alex.
You're welcome.
So it's been a little while here. I want to be respectful of your time. So where can people engage with you if they're loving what they're hearing and they want to learn more and read and study more with you?
Well, I'm in the middle of starting. I'm in the middle of starting.
Middle of a start.
Of a new book on triggers, actually. And so there's that. If people want, I just put together a PDF for people if they want that on triggers. And I think the URL for that is www.dfay.com/triggers. But there's another one. It's another long PDF. It's called The Safe Guide. And again, it's dfay.com/safe guide. And then if people want to find out about their attachment style, I created a little quiz, but the idea was not to have it be from the kind of pejorative way that sometimes we talk about attachment style, is to look at what are the qualities, because they're all good qualities. There's a great benefit to everything. And so that's at dfay.com/profiles.
That's great. We'll put them in our show notes.
Yeah, and I'm always doing courses. We used to travel a lot, but now they're all online. It's sweet. I'm amazed at how deeply connected people can be online, So isn't that wonderful? Like, what a gift.
Yeah.
And I have to say thank you all. You two are just amazing. I feel so heart connected to you, and just I just feel really privileged to have this moment with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Deirdre. It's been a
Thank
pleasure.
You so much. Really. Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.